Show for this week on this 10th day of July 2020. First, let's give you a rundown of what we will be discussing this morning. First, the key Nigerian economic indicators, FDC's perspective on recent policies and tariffs implications on the household, Finance Minister's meeting with the National Assembly over the NTEF and Fiscal Stability Plan, FBN Quest Research analysis on Nigeria's current accounts, highlights of the African Development Bank Economic Outlook 2020, World Bank analysis on COVID-19 containment and economic revival, and updates on the U.S. jobless claims. First, let's give you the current economic indicators in Nigeria at the moment. Our current growth rate as at first quarter 2020 for gross domestic product is 1.87%. Unemployment rate is 23.1%. Our misery index is 55.3%. Our manufacturing PMI, Performance Managers Index, is 41.1%. Our interest rate is 12.5%. Inflation is 12.4%. Capital importation at the end of first quarter 2020 is currently $3.080 billion, while our foreign reserve is $36.15 billion. Those are indicators that you need to know when you look at Nigeria's economy. So let's begin with the Financial Derivatives Company's recent publication on the policies and tariffs and implications for households in Nigeria, which published also on ProShare, Nigeria's leading financial information hub. First, it looks at the recent adjustment of the petroleum motor spirit pump price, which was increased by 18% to 143 naira per litre. FDC states that the Petroleum Product Pricing Regulatory Agency had announced an increase in the pump price of petrol by about 18% to 143 naira 80 kobo per litre. This is reflective of the 26% rise in the average price of Brent crude to $40.87 in June from $32.41 in May. Following the removal of petrol subsidies and the gradual shift to a deregulated market, PMS prices will depend on global crude oil prices and movements in the exchange rates. However, the PPRA will continue in its price modulation and give monthly price guidance after reviewing prevailing market fundamentals and considering marketers' realistic operating costs. Based on the average fuel consumption of about 58 million litres, the effect of this price increase is a $1.18 billion reduction in aggregate consumption compared to $278.4 billion, and a resultant increase in transport costs, which will show that transport cost accounts for 6.6% of consumers' expenditure across the country. What are the implications of these PMS adjustments to households? The price increase by 22 naira simply means that the average Nigerian will spend more on petrol and may be forced to adjust spending patterns with less demand for non-essential and luxury goods. That is something that everybody must take note of. Also, we have the new electricity tariff hike. The cost-reflective tariff hike, according to FDC, scheduled for July 2020, has now been postponed for the second time to the first quarter of 2020. This came after a review meeting with the National Assembly. The National Electricity Regulatory Commission and representatives of the electricity distributors had a meeting to discuss these issues. Also, the World Bank recently approved a $750 million loan to the power sector in the country. The tariff increase is expected to cater for revenue shortfalls in the sector and offset the high cost of electricity generation in the country. What will be the implications of electricity tariff hike for households in Nigeria? This could be a disincentive to investors, stalling the much-needed investment in the sector. This, coupled with the increase in the pump price, that's the PMS, of about 143 naira a litre, and food prices will further reduce consumer disposable income. To manufacturers, this will increase the operating costs and ultimately product prices, pointing to a transfer of the cost burden to consumers. Subsequently, this will boost investment in the sector as the market is now cost-reflective. Eventually, electricity generation and supply could increase and in turn lower prices, thereby capping the effect of the initial price hike. Let's look at the gas pricing policy, which is part of the policies and impacts that is being analyzed by the FDC. The price of energy products in Nigeria, such as gas, has been a subject of controversy for many years, now forcing the federal government to review the pricing framework. This is expected to boost activities in the gas industry, increase supply and the use of gas-related products like cooking gas, making it affordable, and CNG, an alternative to petrol. Also, the government recently flagged off the Ajakuta-Kano-Kaduna gas pipeline project, and for those of you that followed, that is a massive project that should create jobs and also drive a gas revolution across the nation. What are the implications of this gas pricing review on households and generally Nigerians? The immediate effect would be an increase in the price of gas products like cooking gas, which implies higher costs for households, but in the near term, as investments gradually pick up in the industry, prices will drop. Also, this policy could address the problem of gas shortages, which remains the major constraint to power generation in the country. Higher gas output could increase power supply, which is beneficial to all economic agents, households, firms, and the government. And so that is something to take note of. Now let's look at the Federal Inland Revenues Service enforcement of the stamp duties. The Federal Inland Revenue Service announced the enforcement of stamp duties on house rent, certificate of occupancy, among other chargeable transactions. This in line with the revenue generation strategy of the federal government of Nigeria. According to FDC, the implications of this to households and the entire nation is that the FIRS generated about 66 billion naira from stamp duties between January and May 2020, from 18 billion naira from January to December 2019. At a time of dwindling revenues from oil, the enforcement of stamp duty could boost government revenues. However, this could erode consumers' disposable income and exert pressures on the revenues of companies across the board. And those are very, very insightful insights or understanding of how decisions and policies will impact the households. And that was from the Financial Derivatives Company published on ProShare. Now let's get on to the next interesting insight on Nigeria's current account from the FBN Quest research. It says that Nigeria's current account deficit narrowed in first quarter 2020 from minus 5.4% of gross domestic product the previous quarter to minus 4.3%. The trade deficit narrowed in tandem from minus 1.2% to minus 0.4% of GDP. Oil and gas exports of the U.S. $11.2 billion were the lowest since second quarter 2017, but the decline in merchandise imports was still more dramatic, reflecting the lockdown in January in China. The principal source of imports and the same event in Nigeria itself in March. Non-oil imports decreased by US it decreased by $4 billion on the previous quarter. There was a smaller decline in services imports led for obviously reasons driven by transportation. This was the seventh current account deficit in succession. This unwelcome trend stems from the stagnation in the oil and gas sector, the narrow production base of manufacturing, population growth of about 3% per year, and a preference in some quarters for imported goods and services. Encouragingly, the balance of payments for Nigeria's data showed a healthy increase in non-oil exports from $3.5 billion in 2017 to $4.7 billion and $10.5 billion in 2018 and 2019 respectively. The underlying success stories could include cements, cigarettes, cashew nuts, sesame seeds, and cocoa. The Central Bank of Nigeria showed these exports as non-oil and electricity because the federal government has an agreement to export power to Niger Republic. Making a call for second quarter, FBN Quest Research presents a challenge. It says the shadows of recession and of the pipeline of delayed external payments hang over the balance of payments arrangements. Merchandise exports will have fallen due to the weaker crude price, notably in April, and imports due to the domestic lockdown and squeezing of demand. Debits for travel, transportation, and business services would have fallen sharply. For the compilation of this quarter's data, the Central Bank of Nigeria Statistics Department would have again worked with its revised assumption for informal cross-border exports and imports following the land border closure in mid-August. That is from FBN Quest Research looking at Nigeria's current account. Now to a story from yesterday. The Nigerian Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, Dr. Zainab Shamsuna Ahmed, met with the leadership of the National Assembly on plans to submit the 2021 to 2023 medium-term expenditure framework and fiscal strategy paper later this month. The minister, while briefing principal officers of the Senate and House of Representatives, led by the Senate President Ahmed Lawan and the Speaker Femi Gbajabiamila, disclosed that the President had given directives for the ministry to expedite action on next year's budget estimates to enable him present the 2021 budget proposal to the National Assembly by the end of September this year. Mrs. Ahmed further disclosed that in keeping strictly with the January to December budget cycle, the President will today, sign into law the revised 10.8 trillion naira budget for the year 2020 passed by the National Assembly in June. We'll be monitoring that to bring that to you later. According to her, this for us is a journey towards ensuring that the progress that is made as a collective to return the fiscal year to January to December is maintained for 2021 budget as well. She further went on to say that the President has directed that we must deliver the budget to the National Assembly by the end of September. Dr. Ahmed, while giving an update on the 2020 budget implementation between January and May 2020, stated that the federal government retained revenue was 1.48 trillion naira, an amount representing 56% of government's target. She added that out of the sum generated as revenue, all revenues accounted for 701.6 billion naira, non-oil tax revenues accounted for 439.32 billion naira, companies' income tax and value-added tax collections were 213.24 billion naira and 68.09 billion naira, while customs collection was 158 billion naira, respectively. Other revenues amounted to 239.51 billion naira, of which independent revenues was 80.22 billion naira. Recoveries and stamp duty collected during the period were yet to be booked into the fiscal accounts. On expenditure performance for the same period, January to May 2020, she disclosed that 1.25 trillion naira was expended for debt service and 1.32 trillion naira for personnel costs, including pensions. According to the Finance Minister, as at the end of May 2020, only 253.33 billion naira had been released for capital expenditure. Ahmed, while giving underlying assumptions driving the macroeconomic parameters and targets of the 2021 to 2023 medium-term expenditure framework, said same was revised in line with the emerging realities. He stated that the oil price benchmark for 2021 fiscal year was pegged at $35 and $40 for 2022 and 2023. Oil production, in terms of the oil production barrels per day, was placed at 1.86 million barrels per day for 2021, 2.09 million barrels per day for 2022, and 2.38 million barrels per day for 2022 fiscal year, while the exchange rate remains at 260 naira to a dollar. Ahmed stressed that although Nigeria's total production capacity currently is 2.5 million barrels per day, current crude production is about 1.4 million barrels per day in compliance with the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries production quota and an additional 300,000 barrels per day of condensates, totaling about 1.7 million barrels per day. She added that while the World Bank forecasts that crude oil prices will rise gradually from an average of $42 per barrel in 2021 to $44.5 per barrel in 2022 and $47 per barrel in 2023, it is also expected that Brent crude oil prices may average $41 per barrel during the second half of 2020 and $50 per barrel during 2021, climbing as high as $53 per barrel by the end of next year. According to her, the nominal gross domestic product is expected to increase from 130 billion naira in 2020 to 132.125 billion naira in 2021, and then up to 138.415 billion naira in 2023. Senate President Ahmed Lawan, in his own remarks, said this meeting was very strategic, the meeting of yesterday, and that the main purpose of the meeting was to ensure that the Minister of Finance engages and briefs the leadership of the National Assembly on the 2021 to 2023 medium-term expenditure framework and fiscal strategy paper. According to him, therefore, it would not be wrong to say that the journey to the presentation of the 2021 budgets estimates by the executive arm of government has started in earnest. According to him, his expectation of the National Assembly that this journey will lead to the presentation or laying of the budget estimates by the President before the end of September by the grace of God. Africa, giving the outlook, revised economic outlook for Africa in 2020. Here are some key excerpts from that highlight and report. The first is that the COVID-19 pandemic, if not addressed expeditiously, poses a high risk for the onset of a major humanitarian and public health disaster for Africa. With new cases of virus infection doubling every 7 to 14 days for most countries in Africa, and with 33 of the countries having very low health system preparedness to face the pandemic, its impact threatens to upend the continent's recent development trajectory and will require the undivided attention of African governments and international community. As a result of the pandemic, Africa's GDP is projected to contract in 2020 by 1.7% in the baseline scenario, which assumes a substantial impact of the virus, but over a short duration. In the worst-case scenario, which considers the virulent impact of the virus over a longer duration, the pandemic continues beyond the first half of 2020, GDP will fall by 3.4% in the region. A partial recovery of about 3% is projected for 2021, but the projected recovery in 2021 will not make up for an estimated cumulative loss to Africa's GDP of $173.1 billion, that is $236.7 billion for 2020 and 2021 due to the pandemic. Significant variations in economic impacts of COVID-19 are expected across African countries, depending on their sectoral structure and initial conditions. Tourism-dependent, oil exporter, and other resource-intensive economies are expected to be the hardest hit due to the worldwide travel restrictions and the collapse of commodity demand and prices, notably for oil. For countries in these groups, growth in 2020 is expected to contract on average by more than 4 percentage points. Less resource-intensive economies, thanks to more diversified economic structure, are expected to be more resilient to the shock. Fiscal deficits are projected to double and debt levels to increase by an additional 10 percentage points of GDP. Thus, the pandemic will create an additional public sector financing gap of $122 billion in the region. However, the tightening of global financial markets has been reflected in the fight to safety trends that have drained liquidity from emerging markets and in sharp declines in foreign direct investment, remittances, and portfolio flows. An additional 28.2 to 49.2 million Africans could be pandemic. The direct impact of the pandemic on more than 23 million already vulnerable workers in Africa would drive the total number of people living in extreme poverty to 463 million in worst-case scenario as unemployment levels jump. Given the global scale of the pandemic, the FDB says governments and development partners must respond in a manner that is coordinated, targeted, and rapid, using all available policy levers. These levers include a well-targeted public health response to contain the spread of the virus and minimize fatalities, a monetary policy response to ease liquidity constraints and solvency risk, a fiscal response to cushion the economic impacts of the virus and to protect vulnerable groups, labor market policies to protect workers and their jobs, and structural policies to prepare for a post-COVID-19 world and build resilience to future shocks. On reopening economies, the AFDB advises policymakers to follow a phased and incremental approach that carefully evaluates the trade-offs between restarting economic activity too quickly and safeguarding the health of the population. Economic activities can be restarted incrementally on the basis of the transmission risk of different sectors. Businesses considered as having low to medium transmission risk, such as manufacturing, construction, and some retail services, can be reopened first. Next, government should observe whether there is a rebound of cases of infection before proceeding to reopen economic activities considered to have high transmission risk, such as hotels, schools, restaurants, and sports and entertainment venues. That is the insights from the African Development Bank revised Africa Economic Outlook for 2020. Now let's go on to World Bank's insight into containing the COVID-19 pandemic and achieving economic stability. According to the World Bank, the coronavirus pandemic is the most urgent global crisis of its time, exposing structural weaknesses and exacerbating inequality. As countries grapple with the impact of COVID-19, policymakers are seeking effective, balanced solutions to address both public health and economic recovery challenges. To understand which approaches have been successful and how this might help other countries and regions, the World Bank hosted a session with policymakers from Colombia, Ghana, South Africa, Vietnam, and Italy's Veneto region. World Bank sought to learn from the experience in designing, communicating, and implementing strategies to mitigate the public health crisis and prepare for economic revival. Global experts in health and economics, Peter Port and Carmen Reinhardt, added their insights on the complex but necessary balance between public health and economic needs. The discussion highlighted that countries and development partners are continuing to learn while implementing risk mitigation measures. A few critical elements emerged from the conversation, and let's go to those elements. Rapid and decisive action is critical. Successful responses have all involved early action and extensive testing, tracing contacts, and physically isolating unwell patients while adapting nimbly to rapidly changing conditions. Leadership must build trust and communicate honestly. This means being open and working with partners and communities to help people respond to the pandemic and take necessary precautions. Next is the crisis presents an opportunity to improve the quality and reach of critical services, not just in healthcare, but also social protection. Example is digital payments to reach vulnerable populations who work in informal economy or lack access to bank accounts. The speakers emphasized that this is a time in the early days of the pandemic. An effective response will require a high level of coordination and cooperation both within and across countries using the full gamut of tools and options. Looking at countries, Vietnam first was obliged to act quickly and mobilize its people due to limited healthcare resources, a large population, dense cities and borders with other countries affected by the outbreak. Dr. Dang Quang Tan from the Ministry of Health explained that the response of Vietnam included strict screening at ports of entry, aggressive testing, contact tracing, and quarantining. The government communicated through various media and worked with communities to combat the disease. Such strategies were informed by experience with past epidemics, including SARS and H1N1. To date, the health impact of COVID-19 has been relatively small in Vietnam, and economic activity has largely returned to normal. Looking at Italy, which is a wealthier nation, the country has an older population that made it more vulnerable to the COVID-19 pandemic. The country has a decentralized health system and has been less affected by other recent outbreaks of communicable diseases. The region of Veneto fared better than many other regions in northern Italy, and this, according to regional advisor Dr. Andrea Crisanti, described how this region responded quickly through rapid testing, contact tracing, isolation and surveillance to monitor the spread, especially among essential workers, the elderly and other vulnerable groups, with an early lockdown of the town that recorded the first outbreak. The approach prevented hospitals from being overwhelmed or becoming hotspots for disease transmission. Veneto is also innovating by helping companies screen employees using artificial intelligence to gauge their risk profile based on contact volume and mobility, so that they can test those at higher risk more regularly. Ghana in West Africa responded quickly to the pandemic by closing airports, deploying community health workers to test and trace contacts, and isolating positive cases, including ramping up local production capacity for personal protective equipment and other medical supplies. Dr. Anthony Nsia Asare, advisor to the president, discussed that the country imposed a lockdown in the two largest cities in the country and slowed community spread by promoting hand washing, distancing, and mask wearing. Messages were broadcast from the president, who stressed and assured that the country was working together to address the pandemic. The efforts building on robust systems had slowed the spread of the virus and allowed certain sectors of the economy to carefully reopen while providing support to sectors of the economy such as tourism that is yet to recover. In South Africa, the response to the pandemic was imposing a lockdown and using community health workers to test people, building on experience in battling HIV and tuberculosis. Economic advisor to the president, Trudy Makaya, noted challenges in getting enough test kits, addressing risk in public transport systems, and quickly managing disease hotspots. With the crisis exacerbating inequality, South Africa has focused on distributing social relief funds to reach a greater proportion of the population and especially to prevent people from going further into poverty. The country has also staggered payment days to avoid crowding at payment points or shopping areas and is supporting increases in public works to create more jobs. Going forward, the goal will be to address fiscal deficits while working towards a greener economy and greater regional integration to bolster the recovery. For Colombia, the highlight was the challenge of sufficient testing while reaching and supporting the 50% of its people who work in the informal economy. Luis Guillermo Plata Pérez, who has been leading the country's COVID-19 response, stressed that there is no choice between saving lives and saving the economy. Both are needed, and enhanced testing can accelerate economic reopening. The government has worked closely with the private sector, resulting in dozens of companies switching production to manufacturing personal protective equipment and ventilators. The crisis has also accelerated the use of technology and digitization, which gives hope for a more prosperous future for all Colombians. It was clear from the sessions across the regions in the world that policymakers see that public health and economic recovery are intertwined, according to the World Bank. Panelists were optimistic that countries will be better prepared for any future waves of the disease with greater knowledge and experience now of what works to minimize both the health and economic impacts of the pandemic. As moderated by Martin Wolf, the summary was that we went into this together and will come out of this together. It will be hard for most countries to recover fully without the world healing together. We very much believe this is the case. Interesting insights from the World Bank, conversation with countries on how they're responding to the pandemic. And I want to wrap this up with the United States of America, which is one of the worst hits in terms of the pandemic. Looking at the latest jobless claims, the number of Americans filing for jobless benefits has dropped to a nearly 4-month low last week. But the record 32.9 million people were collecting unemployment checks in the third week of June, supporting expectations that the labor market would take years to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. Economists cautioned against reading too much into the bigger than expected decline in jobless claims reported by Labor Departments this week, Thursday, noting that the period included the July 4th Independence Day claims and that the data with record spikes of the new coronavirus cases, which have forced authorities to scale back or pause reopenings of businesses and sending some workers home again. Bankruptcies are rising amid weak demand, and businesses have exhausted government loans, which had enabled them to keep workers on their payrolls. Initial claims for state unemployment benefits dropped by 99,000 to a seasonally adjusted 1,214,000 for the week ended July 4th. The 14th straight week decline pushed claims to their lowest level since mid-March, when non-essential businesses were closed to slow the spread of the respiratory illness. Claims peaked at a historic 6,867,000 in late March. They remained roughly double their highest point during the 2007-2009 Great Recession. Economists polled by Reuters had forecast that 1,375 million applications in the latest week had come in, including a program funded by the government where 2.4 million people filed claims last week. There were big declines in unemployment insurance applications in Georgia, California, and Florida, despite the resurgence in coronavirus infections. Texas, however, recorded a surge in filings. Stocks on the Wall Street were lower. The dollar edged up against a basket of currencies across the globe, and the U.S. Treasury price rose. Just showing you how a very active period has been this week, and the one major thing we take away from here is that in this period of the pandemic, the balance between health and economy remains at the forefront, and a lot of wisdom is required from government to ensure that this is effective. I guess you've had an interesting week. I would just like to say that's a wrap for the Economy and Politics show for what has been an interesting week. Please send your comments and views to news@proshenji.com. Also join our website www.proshenji.com to watch our videos, read our news reports and analysis. Till we come your way again in whatever political economic debate and conversation you engage, make sure it is constructive and productive. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day and stay safe. But don't forget, 10 a.m., we have the market review.